What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Live Big, Lift Big podcast. Today, I have my two partners in crime. So we have Mac Daddy, aka Alex Q Macklin, who
What's
is
up?
physically here, mentally probably playing his Xbox. And then we have fellow Paragon founder, world's most shredded dad, and expert cookie baker, Bryan Boorstein. What's up, my man?
Hey guys, just over here thinking about baking cookies later.
What kind of cookies, man? What kind of cookies you be digging?
I mean, it's not always cookies. It's whatever we have. I would say the majority of the time I end up baking something with bananas in it because we buy like 10 bananas at a time and then
they all go
like
bad.
6 of them get eaten. So, and then there's nothing like baking with semi-rotten bananas. They just like make the thing turn out super fantastic. So I would say half the time it's banana something. And then the other half, it's a mix of like cookies, brownies, some sort of concoction like that.
So, Alex, my favorite part about this is when I met Bryan the very first time, I just remember texting one of my best friends at the time, and I was like, dude, this guy's forearms are so huge, like he's so jacked, but he also loves baking. It just like made for this awesome mental image of like Bryan, without a shirt on, but a little white apron.
Like with an apron on, yeah, just like up in the
That's Bryan, how I do it, of course, every time.
Bryan, I'm telling you, if fitness doesn't work out, this could be a great opportunity for like some kind of new viral TikTok thing that you do.
I'm going to think about it. We'll go
with
further.
The Boorstein.
The BB. Wow.
Yes. Bodies and baking or something like that, right?
I love it. You heard it here first, right here.
But if you go viral, Alex and I are going to need a cut of that share, It'd just be like that. Well, today's podcast is going to be sponsored by Paragon Training Methods. If you're not familiar, Paragon is actually Bryan and I's fitness baby. So it is the life-changing workouts, coaching, and online fitness community you've been searching for to help you build muscle, achieve your goals, and look and feel damn good. This month of January is basically one giant Paragon party. We will be getting that bread because there are brand new 6-week training cycles beginning for hypertrophy and for strength, which actually brings us to today's podcast because we basically want to chatter all about hypertrophy training versus strength training and all of that good stuff. So, Bryan, we hear you're kind of a big deal. You're definitely pretty jacked. So tell us a quick summary, just kind of about you, your background, and all the goodness.
Yeah, for sure. About 15 years old, I started training mostly because I was trying to get bigger and be able to compete on the court with some of the guys that were a little further ahead than me on this puberty train. I was actually really, really slow to puberty. I don't think I actually fully got into it until like 17, 18. And most guys are 14, 15.
This is basketball?
Yeah.
Bryan.
Yeah, did I not say that?
No. Would you believe that I was one of the taller kids in my class up until like, I don't know, like it was probably like junior high, like first year of high school, and then suddenly, teeny weeny. But I had my moment.
Side note, Bryan can hoop, y'all. Like for real.
Yeah.
Like he can play. Like
it's been a while, but yeah, it's something I love for sure. So actually the story is kind of funny because it was partially for basketball and then it was partially because in 9th grade I was 5'2" and 135 pounds, which isn't like no one would say you're fat at 5'2", 135, but I was certainly soft. And some kid in science class decided to pick on me and just started calling me the Pillsbury Doughboy over and over and over. And eventually we started throwing blows in science class. And I was so lit. It was close, man. It was close. But man, I was so livid from it that it was like that next day I went into the gym and started training. So it worked for both improving my ability to not be made fun of. It helps me get more girls, which is always a nice tangential benefit. And it helped me on the basketball court. So weightlifting has been a huge asset in my life. But essentially, it took over and became the driving passion for me. And it was sort of inevitable that I was just going to go into this at some point. So I majored in exercise science in college, continued training all through school. And most of I would say the first 10 years of my journey in fitness was strength and bodybuilding, or you could call hypertrophy work, which is fitting, because that is our topic today, is to kind of discuss the differences between training for strength and training for hypertrophy. But both of those were kind of where I got my beginning. And then after college, I worked corporate America for a few years, and eventually my college roommate, a guy named Anders Varner, moved out to San Diego, and we decided to start CrossFit PB together, CrossFit Pacific Beach, which 2010, it was still relatively early in the CrossFit days. And I found great success there. It was probably the best decision of my life to do that, because it got me into the fitness industry and allowed me to begin working in the online space coaching in 2011, which is now at this point about 12 years ago.
You're
Continued through
You're basically a dinosaur. You know that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm 40, dude. It's wild. But in 2016, I kind of started this venture out of CrossFit. And as people know that are really deep into the CrossFit thing, it's not super easy to just rip that Band-Aid off and be like, I am done with CrossFit. So you have so much of your identity tied to, I can snatch this much, or I can do muscle ups, or I can do toes to bar, whatever the different movements are. You identify with that ability. And so it was very much a gradual process of me moving out of CrossFit and then into more of this kind of physique space. And so in 2016, 2017, I started creating a bunch of programs that I called hybrid style, which was basically like a combo of CrossFit with some Olympic lifting and stuff like that, along with more of like a bodybuilding physique style approach. And then over the course of the years, I was able to disassociate my identity with those CrossFit movements and really just fell in love with the pursuit of the physique enhancement side, because it is super sustainable. And as you get older, you have these joints that just become more fragile. There's certain movements that you just can't do. And one thing about CrossFit is that there are movements you have to do.
Right.
And as we'll get into it, the pursuit of strength is similar. Like when you have the power lifts, like the bench, squat, and deadlift, you have to do those lifts. So it's hypertrophy is this super, what's the word I'm looking for? Malleable pursuit, where there's so many different ways that you can go about pursuing hypertrophy and so many different movements that you can use, that it really is conducive to longevity. And so in 2017, I linked up with LCK, started training her one-on-one. In late 2017, she was like, we need to show this to the world. And we started Paragon Training Methods. In 2018, now we're going into year 5, and it's just been quite a journey so far.
I still remember even I would say even through 2018, 2019, Brian and I would be texting each other on the side to be like for me, a specific lift was I just need to be able to snatch 135. As long as I can snatch 135, we're good. But same thing. I don't remember what the specific lift was, but you had one too. I think it was as long as I can clean and jerk this weight or something like that. So it's so funny because it's CrossFit obviously attracts people that previously were athletes. It's something to pursue. It's super fun. There's
really
kind of
hard
that
too.
Yeah, it's really hard. And so there's so much community and kind of, doing something really hard together. And so, from the community aspect to also not train solo dolo and be able to, have fun and do things with people. But mutually, it's Alex and I were just talking about this, where it's I loved CrossFit when I did it. Obviously, I was deep in the sauce, when I first met Bryan. But it's fast forward present day, and I don't know that many people in my friend circle that's still CrossFitting present day.
Yeah.
And I find that super interesting. It's everybody we know, it's everybody does jujitsu. If you're a dude, you fell in love with jujitsu, became the thing. But on the actual gym front side, truly it's majority of people that I know now bodybuild. And I think that's super fascinating because it's I remember being in my 20s and being go hard every day. I used to be the queen of hashtag no rest days.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, you used to compete competitively in CrossFit. You're a CrossFit regional competitor, yeah.
Yes. So I was a competitive gymnast my whole life, and then did like marathon training and did a lot of long distance stuff in college. Was kind of having like an identity crisis because I was like, so addicted to like training for something and just like the pursuit of, self betterment there. Right. And so got into CrossFit, and I never expected to get into the competitive side. I just happened to be like good at it. But yeah, so I basically competed 2016, and then I ended up tearing my shoulder. And so that was actually what expedited leading to Bryan. Was like, fast forward, it was like, well, so many years I didn't know what to be doing on the nutrition front, what to be doing on the training front. And so it's like, at a big macro view, when I met Bryan, like I was a hot mess express. It was like, like my hormones were all tanked out. Like my thyroid levels, hormone levels were freaking trash. I physically felt like garbage. So it was like, I had shoulder surgery, but it's like, I just remember, when I would go back to the gym, I would try to be, get back into doing the thing. And it'd be like, I would finish a lift set and I would feel super dizzy, or like feel like I'm going to like black out during a lift set. Or, so it was just like, it was clearly evident to me of like, hey, like your body is not picking up what you've been putting down on the nutrition front. It's like I knew, it's like I spent so many years struggling with eating disorder and just not eating enough. So, at macro view, it was like, well, years compounded of not eating enough food, not knowing what I was doing with training, not actually prioritizing recovery. It's like, it's interesting to look back on, because it's like recovery in my world was like, oh, well, like I go to cryotherapy and I do Normatec and I do all of these things. I would see like a chiro and get, physical manual tissue work once or twice a week. So it was like I was doing all of the like bougie, expensive recovery, but I wasn't actually understanding the concept that doing more training isn't necessarily better. And I wasn't understanding, again, it's like hashtag no rest days. If you scroll back far enough on the Instagram, you'll see like hashtag no rest days, you'll see all of that stuff. So it's like, it wasn't until I met Bryan and kind of just all the wheels were off the bus and I just felt like total garbage, that it was like, okay, well, insanity is also, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different response or, a different outcome. And so when I met Bryan, it was like, here I was coming back from shoulder surgery. I was still trying to do the most in the gym. I was still wanting to train the same exact way I was doing. I was wanting to do all of this volume and not take rest days and do, high intensity exercise 24/7, 365. But mutually thought that doing the same things I was doing would help me feel better, right? And so it's like, that was actually like something I jotted down to ask Bryan, was like, how annoying was I to work with as a one-on-one client? Because it's like, we still, like way back in the day, it's like with Paragon now, you download an app, everything's through Train Heroic, and it's super dope. But it's like, the way that Bryan used to do one-on-one coaching was actually pretty cool, because it was just, he would create a Facebook group basically for, the client and then for him. And then he would post the workouts for the week. And then you could obviously give feedback, change things or whatever. But it's like, I just remember I would always be, and I mean, again, it's like he gave me shit about this forever after the fact. But it's like, here I would be like, hey, so like this bodybuilding and, more strength focused approach is cool, but like, I still want to do heavy deadlifts, or like, can you make it a little more sexy? Can you like, hey, can we do like more kipping gymnastics? Hey, can we do more like Metcon-y, conditioning or stuff like that? And it's just like, again, I was bought into this idea of like, okay, I know that I need to do something different. But then mutually, it's like I was, I would kind of keep going the back end of like, hey, so like, but can you like make this a little more CrossFit-y? Hey, like this is really cool. And like, I'm buying into it, but also like, I'm finishing my workouts and I don't feel like, dead. I don't feel, I don't feel sweaty and sore.
Yeah. We hear that. Bryan, how do you address that? How do you merge the two things kind of together, or do you?
Well, I think you kind of have to decide what your goal is and then make the decision of what you're going to include. I mean, so if we kind of go back to that idea that I was talking about, your joints become taxed when you do CrossFit. And there's all these movements that you have to do. And then to Lori's point, like your identity being tied to those movements. I think you just have to make an audit kind of what is really driving you towards your goals. And so like when you look at my experience there, my knees hurt all the time and my elbows hurt all the time and my shoulders hurt some of the time. And
Wait. Did you have emotional support knee sleeves? Because like I love ripping on this because it's like if I look back, it was like, yo, I literally couldn't touch a barbell if I didn't have like weightlifting shoes, knee sleeves, belt. Like I might as well have like a safety helmet because I had to have all the things, right? And it's like bodybuilding, you don't have that. Like it's not that like CrossFit's bad. It's just like you're doing so much output, so much volume. It's like you shouldn't be competing in training, but you are. The goal is, well, hey, I'm gonna be the fastest one this workout. I'm gonna get the most reps, and so it's like by default, you would just end up with, feeling like you played in traffic, feeling like you got run over by a bus on the regular, right?
Yeah, I mean, so CrossFit is this thing where you have to be good at so many things. So you're actually benefited by becoming better at these skills and honing your craft, so to speak, right? But the difference is, and I use this analogy a lot when people ask me about CrossFit, is like when you look at a basketball player practicing their foul shots, they can sit there for hours and hours and hours and just shoot over and over, hundreds of shots. There's almost no fatigue effect from doing that, but they're getting better at their craft. When you try to get better at your craft in CrossFit, you have to do so by basically working out. Like a practice session is like, okay, maybe I'll take it easy today and I'll do like 5 squat clean thrusters on 1 minute and like 5 muscle ups on the other minute or something like that. And that's like an easy session because you're getting like built-in rest in there. But at the end of the day, you're still moving dynamically. You're still stressing your joints. You're still causing a cortisol increase. You're still doing these things that maybe are not the best for your hormones. And we know that if the goal is for you to just look better and be healthy, that the dose that you need is so much lower than what these people that are trying to improve at CrossFit, like someone who's trying to compete in CrossFit, the dose that you need is so much lower for that. And so that was one of the big things that drove me toward this more strength hypertrophy thing, was understanding that I can still look the same or better as I did during CrossFit, but I can work out for a third of the time or a quarter of the time.
That's huge, man. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge like minimum effective dose. Like, especially if you've been training the way you have been training or you're experiencing a lot of like issues and pain, like what can you do the least and still get the result that you're looking for? That's huge for longevity's sake.
Well, and also, right, it's like, I think for so many people, like that was the hardest thing was it was like, I really, it's like when you're doing CrossFit, I was working out so much, I was doing so much volume that's like, well, yeah, like, pretty shredded, was looking good. And so it's also just like, okay, if I'm going to change up my training or something like that, well, like, how do I get that? Or maybe I don't, for a lot of people, I will say this, it's like when I was the most competitive at CrossFit is mutually when I also looked the worst, because it's like for me personally, I'm 5'3", like I am a literal nugget. It's like when I meet people in real life, they're like, oh, like for some reason I thought you were tall. Like I thought you were going to be like, I don't know, 5'6", 5'9", and then I like show up, I'm like a little muppet, right? Little 5'3" me. That's like to be competitive at CrossFit, I had to put on size. It's like I actually missed. Like literally barely missed going on a team for CrossFit the year before I actually ended up going and competing. And it was just purely, there was a choice between 2 girls, and it was a girl that was taller, bigger, and could just move weight. And then obviously, I was kind of your like gymnastics specialist, obviously endurance and stuff like that. So it was like, okay, well, which one do you want to choose? But like, it was such a big wake up call for me of like, yo, like we got to get big, right? And so I think that's huge too, where it's like so many people look at CrossFit Games athletes or look at all these people that, compete at regionals, compete at the games, all this stuff. And they assume like, oh, well, if I just do CrossFit, I'll look like that. And it's like, well, for so many of those people, that's really likely genetics is going to be absolutely huge
outliers
there.
for sure.
So they are the N equals 1, they're that 1%. But then 2, also, it's like you're just doing so much training volume, right? It's like if you talk to games athletes, it's like, oh, hey, I'm spending 3 to 4 hours in the morning, 3 to 4 hours at night, double sessions, all this stuff. So it's like, well, yeah, like I would hope doing that much volume, but most people aren't doing that volume, right? Most people
the
are
average
doing an
person
hour.
doesn't have that. Yeah, the average person, like the dad, like, or the mom that has like 3 kids, like in a job, like they don't have like 5 hours a day to go sit in a CrossFit gym and train all day long. No way.
So if you have like 45 to 60 minutes only, and you're deciding to fill that time with 15 minutes of general class warm up, and then maybe like a part A strength piece, and then you have like maybe a part B, but if not, then some sort of Metcon or circuit piece. A lot of the CrossFit movements that are used, they don't really train any specific area of your body super well. Like they're really good at getting you in just general good shape and being really good for your health outcomes. But most people don't get into CrossFit because they just want general health outcomes. Most people get in because they see the game's athletes and they want to look like them. And so if you have like 45 to 60 minutes 4 times a week, spending that time doing circuits and a teeny bit of low rep strength work is probably not going to be as efficient for your goal as some more like specific acute kind of muscle targeting, which is, more of what we do.
Dude, and well, like, think about it. Like, that's one of my favorite things about Paragon is when we do run our strength cycles, because we do get so many women that maybe they come from an endurance background. And so they were doing a lot of running. They were doing a lot of like Spartan races, ultra marathons, or reversely, we get women that were coming from the CrossFit background or the group fitness side of things, where it was like, hey, I'm doing Orange Theory or just any sort of, I go to Equinox and do group fitness classes. And it's like, they run a strength cycle for 6 or 12 weeks with us, and it'll be like, oh, I'm hitting PRs of not just, like 5 or 10 pounds on lifts, but quite literally it'd be like, yo, I'm ripping a 300-pound deadlift. I hit a PR of 20, 30, 50 pounds. Like it's huge because again, it's just like this population of women that they've never actually followed programming with progressive overload. They've never actually followed, specific training cycles with specific intents and stuff like that, which actually segues, perfectly into what we were wanting to get into today, which is just, the different ways of training that are available out there in terms of hypertrophy and then in terms of strength. So obviously hypertrophy is like kind of a sexy buzzword we hear all the time. It's like hypertrophy. Again, I just go back to like CrossFit Lori that didn't know, shit from fuck about anything. And so my question is, it's like, if you were going to explain hypertrophy in a really simple, kind of beginner friendly level, or if you were talking to LCK from, again, 2017, like, how would you explain hypertrophy? And then what does that style of training look like in terms of rep schemes, training volume? How heavy are you lifting? Give us the sauce.
Yeah. So hypertrophy is the increase in muscle size. That's literally how it's defined. And kind of related to hypertrophy is hyperplasia, which is increasing the number of muscle fibers that you have. And that's not something that is done super commonly. There was actually a really cool study from the 90s where they took quail and they tied really light weights to the end of their wings and just let them like flap around and live life. And they actually saw hyperplasia, which is the increase of actual number of muscle fibers. But what we do in our training is mostly going to be hypertrophy, which is the increase of muscle size. So as when we go about training for hypertrophy, the keys are a few things. I think first thing to understand, and the first thing I would tell Lori from 2017, is that your muscle only knows tension. And so this is an important distinction between strength and hypertrophy, because in strength is a skill. Like it sounds silly to say that, like strength is a skill, and hypertrophy is not a skill. But essentially what you're trying to do in strength is be the most efficient you can to move weight from point A to point B. You don't care what muscles are doing that job. You just want to be as efficient as you can. Neuromuscular efficiency would be the term. And so this is part of why you see people that aren't even that big or muscular that are really, really, really strong, because their bodies are just primed in such a way and they're so good at this skill of performing these movements that they can lift really heavy, even though they're maybe not as big as bodybuilders. On the alternative side, we have hypertrophy training, which following this idea of the muscle only knows tension, that's actually one of the things that I love the most about it, because you don't need to lift heavy weights. Like, you do need progressive overload. So that is maybe the biggest confusing factor, is that people think, oh, well, if it's hypertrophy, I just need to think about mind muscle connection and it doesn't really matter how much weight I'm lifting. And that is not exactly true, because if you're doing progressive overload, you are caring about how much weight you lift. You have to think of, yep.
Can you explain what progressive overload is? Just for people who don't really know.
Yeah. No, good call. So progressive overload essentially just means that you're doing more the next week than you were doing the prior week. And that doesn't mean, like most people think progressive overload means I have to add a rep or I have to add weight to have progressive overload occur. In fact, progressive overload can be achieved in a number of ways. It can be achieved through slowing your tempo down. It can be achieved through pausing in different positions of the movement. It can be achieved through just performing the movement better. So there's like a number of different ways that you can even increase volume. Like, that's probably a hammer. Like, if you have the different options of ways you could increase the stimulus, adding a set is like, whoa, that's like a whole ton. Because usually, like, oh, let's just try to add a rep or add 5 pounds. But if you add a whole set, well, that's like a huge hammer. Mm-hmm. So that's not something that we use very often, but it is like another tool in this toolbox. And so hypertrophy just has, like I was saying, this malleable approach where there's so many different ways to roam. And with that knowledge of your muscle only knows tension, the cool thing about hypertrophy is that as long as your form remains consistent week to week, the progressive overload is there's like this theoretical or philosophical view of progressive overload where it's like a chicken and the egg thing. So it's like, do I have to add weight to the bar or add reps or somehow do something so that progressive overload occurs? Or am I adding weight and adding reps because I got stronger and therefore I have to now do more weight or more reps, or else the stimulus won't be enough? And so you can kind of conceptualize that by thinking about, like, hey, if I'm squatting 200 pounds and I do 10 reps, what if I just did 200 pounds for 10 reps forever? And I never tried to do 11 reps. I never tried to do 205 pounds. I just always did 200 pounds for 10. Well, eventually that 10 reps would be too easy. And so progressive overload would be recognizing that 200 by 10 is no longer stimulative. And so what can I do to make sure that 200, or to make sure that it's still stimulative? Well, I can add weight, or I can add reps, or I can add pauses, or I can do all of these number of things that I talked about.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and I think there's so many good things there, because it's like, for me personally, coming from the CrossFit background of all that matters is how much weight did you lift? How fast did you do it? We don't care about, how it looks. We just care what's the weight on your bar, how many reps, what is the end result? And so it's truly, it's like, here I am so many years removed from CrossFit, but I think that one of the things I struggled with most during hypertrophy cycles, like I used to, it's like, I remember specifically, it was like during the Panini, like there was a strength cycle, Alex and I are smashing weight, and it's like, we would get so excited for strength cycles. And then reversely, with hypertrophy, we see higher rep schemes. Strength is like the kind of 1 to 6 reps, with lots of triples or doubles or 5 sets of 5 sort of thing, where it's like hypertrophy is, well, 10 to 12 reps, 12 to 15 reps. And so I would always struggle to pick my weight. Like, I would choose violence. And, it was like, I didn't know how to turn off my ego, because again, it was like, that was the puzzle piece I was missing. It was like, hey, like, yes, your lift sets need to be difficult, but no, you don't need to be redlining. You don't need to be, it's like the most common thing that would happen was, it's like, I would come out hot at the beginning of the training cycle. And then, by week 4 or 5 or 6, you would be like, oh, well, I've only been adding like 2.5 pounds, but I'm definitely not, I wasn't hitting the intended, like stimulus there, because it was like, I just didn't get it. So I think that's so important to understand, is it's like with hypertrophy training, things are still difficult. And, yes, you might be meeting Jesus during your lift sets, but it's a different kind of difficult than like, hey, okay, like I'm trying to move as much weight as humanly freaking possible.
Yeah. Let me just clarify one thing real quick, because I think what you're getting at is this idea of systemic fatigue. So like fatigue throughout your body as a system. And so I remember clearly when I talked to Jason Phillips about taking you on back in like 2017 or whatever, one of the things he pointed out was like, after these workouts, you were really struggling to like sit down and focus and do work and stuff like that. And so that's one of these signs of high systemic fatigue. And so when you first started with me and we were doing more hypertrophy style training and you were still tied to those numbers that you were lifting before, you were now lifting in hypertrophy rep ranges. So you were doing 8 to 12, 10 to 15, whatever that is. But because you were treating them still as if they were strength lifts, that the systemic fatigue that you're feeling from these movements is still almost as prominent as it was when you were doing CrossFit. And so when you're doing hypertrophy training in the ideal optimal way, we actually want to limit or as much as possible eliminate systemic fatigue so that the fatigue that we're feeling is in the peripheral system, which would essentially be your local muscles. So it's like, my quads are smashed or my glutes are smashed, but like my general sense of being, it still feels like fully intact and I'm able to function,
But how do you know if you're doing enough? Like, how do you know like that you're in that, range of not getting a lot of systemic fatigue, but fatiguing the places that you're trying to do?
Well, what does, when you're systemically fatigued, like you can feel that, right? You can tell that your brain is all mush. You can't really focus. You just kind of feel that fatigue, right? Within your body. It maybe affects your sleep, things like that. When you're training the local muscle specifically, you shouldn't feel that systemic fatigue. Like you literally should be able to finish a workout and then you could, eat some post-workout food, whatever it is that you do, and get back on the computer, get back to work and almost feel like you didn't miss a beat. But as far as like whether you did enough, that's a good question because there is this kind of idea that more is better, even in the hypertrophy space. And a lot of this has changed in the last few years as more research has come out. Back in like 2016, 17, there was this whole volume is the primary driver of hypertrophy, meaning the more you do, the more muscle you gain type thing.
That's kind of always what I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah. So that has kind of began to shift in the last year or two. And now there's this idea that mechanical tension is the number one driver of hypertrophy. And that essentially just means applying tension to your muscles. Like anything you do, like you pick up a pencil, there's some mechanical tension. It's just a lot less mechanical tension than there is if you pick up something that's heavy for you. But we use kind of like some subjective signs to determine if you're doing enough. And so one really good subjective sign that these are all, I think, important to note that by themselves, none of them mean anything for a number of reasons, but kind of collectively they do. So you can look at soreness. You can look at, whether your muscle is recovering in time for the next session. We see this a lot with legs where people, for whatever reason, I think it's because most leg movements tend to be lengthened overloaded, which means that the most tension of the movement is at the bottom where your muscle is lengthened. I can talk about that a little more later if we want. But essentially, we have soreness. We want to make sure that we are getting some mild level of soreness, but not so much that it becomes systemically fatiguing. Because you all know that feeling where you like can't even like get up off the toilet without having to like push off with two hands. That's too much soreness. So you want to know that you stimulated the muscle. You want some of what I would call post-session fatigue in the muscle. So like if you just train legs, then you go to walk up the stairs or down the stairs and you're like, whoa, that was super unexpected. Like post-session fatigue means you did a pretty good job of training your target muscle. You can look a little bit at what I would call like disruption in the in session. And so some people also look at pump, but I think pump and disruption can kind of both be linked together into like, hey, is the muscle that I'm working feeling like it's being worked?
Right.
Which is pretty simple. But I think using those subjective signs, and then as far as whether it's enough, like if you're recovering in time for your next session always, and you're improving week to week, then it's enough. I think that you don't have to really worry about whether you're doing enough until you reach a point where you're not progressing. And then the question is, am I not progressing because I'm not doing enough? Or am I not progressing because I'm doing too much?
So what are you looking for, like progression wise? Like, what are you looking for to progress in?
anything, reps, load.
Mm.
Whatever your goal of your training cycle is under your program. So like in our programs, right, at Paragon, we take an increasing effort approach, which I really, really love, because we'll essentially start a block of training, a 6-week block, at an easier effort. And then we'll ramp efforts up over the course of the 6-week block so that at the end, by week 5 or week 6, we're at the hardest effort that we can give. If those efforts that we're giving in week 5 or week 6 are the highest load and reps of the cycle, then that is progression. Then we've worked our way to kind of where we want to be. If we get to the end of that cycle and we're no longer doing, we're no longer moving forward with our movements and our reps and our load and things like that, then now we kind of need to look back and reflect. And it could be training volume. It could be too much training volume. It could be too little training volume. It could be that you're not sleeping well. It could be that you're not eating well. It could be stress in your life. There's so many factors that this is where, the individual really needs to be understood.
Yeah, I think there's so much good stuff there, because it's like, to kind of go back to what you were talking about when we started working together initially, it's like the things that I was struggling with was at whatever time I went to the gym was the time that my workday would stop. So it's like, if I didn't get it done before the gym, it wasn't happening. It's like I couldn't take client calls. At the time I was still doing one-on-one nutrition coaching. And so it's like I would go to the gym, I would do, again, it's not that stress is bad. That's the point of exercise, is to induce stress so that we can achieve outcomes like gaining muscle, improving body composition, gaining strength, whatever it is. So stress isn't bad, but there's a point at which it's a tipping, right? And so it's like, for me, I remember the specific day I was in the kitchen when I texted you. It was when I had the little 400 square foot apartment in Austin that didn't have windows. We called it the Bat Cave. But I remember texting you because I had something happened where a client just needed to be a late night call. So I'd gone to the gym at 5. Here I was at 7 or 8 p.m. And so I took this phone call, was filling out all this stuff, did all this stuff, and had to pause. And I was like, oh my gosh, because reversely, it was I would leave the gym feeling like a zombie. I just wouldn't have mental clarity. And like I said, A plus B no longer equaled. Everything was just, fuzzy or foggy. And so, kind of shifting it into training, that was the biggest thing I noticed. And if you think about it, right, it's that's not sexy to sell, from a marketing perspective, to be oh, you'll have more mental clarity as a result of doing these workouts. That'd be kind of fucking weird.
Everybody just wants to die.
Yeah, everybody wants to look good. Everybody wants to have fun during their workouts. So to be on the left field of but mental clarity, that'd be a weird, weird flex, right? But that's such a huge quality of life piece, because same thing, it's with that training, it's well, if your sex drive is garbage, same thing. It's too much stress is going to translate to things like that as well, where we just start to see, I'm dealing with these hormone issues, or I'm just dealing with, low sex drive, low libido, all this stuff. So it's that training side of well, how do we work hard, but not work too hard? And so I think so much of it comes back to also, it's over the years, how often was I jumping programs every 30 days or every 2 to 3 months? I wasn't, sticking consistently with something, but I also wasn't following the appropriate training, for it. And so I think that's the biggest thing also, is it's are you following a good program? Because that's where everything starts. It's there's so many, workouts out there where it might just be hey, we'll just do 3 sets of 12 or 3 sets of 15, and just very basic. It's fascinating to me that people just willy-nilly put out workouts, and reversely, it's that's why when we when we started Paragon, it was well, dude has been training 25 years. He knows his shit. It's Bryan is truly how passionate I am. I'm this giant nerd about nutrition, and it brings me so much joy. Bryan is that way about training. But, it's how many people base their workouts on, oh, well, I follow this person, they're really hot or they're really good looking, so I bet these training cycles and I bet, this program they put out are super lit. It's yeah, they might have good programming, or they might just have really good genetics. They might have all these things. So it's I think that's the most important part, is it's well, when you follow training that's backed by science and we're looking at, programming based off of, well, what do research studies say? And, what is science saying? Like, that's huge because that points you in the right direction, because then it becomes, okay, are you following a good program? And then am I following the program as prescribed, as intended? And what I come back to too, right, is like, think about your 9 a.m. like CrossFit moms that doesn't matter what the workout is, they're choosing 55, 65 pounds. Like, it could be deadlifts, it could be snatches, it could be whatever. And they're choosing that same weight. It's like, we have to be progressing in our workouts. We need our workouts to be very methodical because we want it to be like a science experiment, right? Like, we want to know exactly what we're doing. We want a surefire way to see progress rather than, okay, well, I'm going to do like a group fitness class on Monday, and then I'm going to do this on Tuesday, and maybe I'll go for a run on Wednesday. It's like, if you're following a plan, it's going to, like, random training equals random results. So when we follow a plan, but we also follow a good plan, like, that's the secret sauce, right? So I think all tons of super good discussion there. Bryan, if we kind of loop back to, I think one, again, it's like all of these questions come from like Lori that just like didn't understand these things. When we're looking at a hypertrophy cycle side by side with a strength cycle, what sort of lifts and movements might we see in one of those versus the other? Because I feel like that's a super common question. And again, like, I was this person too, where it'd be like, hey, so this is all cool, but like, I really love deadlifts. Like, can we like do like, hey, I know we're like doing all this, but like, can we also like, can I add in some deadlifts on the side? So like, with both training cycles, we see very intentionally chosen movements in those training. So can you kind of explain that difference between the two and why we see those?
Yeah, for sure. So in strength cycles, we tend to see movements that extend at multiple joints. And the deadlift is a great example of that, as would be like a standard back squat. Both these movements tend to have more of that systemic fatigue that I referred to before. And so when you do a deadlift, you are down in the start position. Your ankles are flexed, your knees are flexed, and your hips are flexed, right? So you have three different joints of your body that are going to need to act upon the load simultaneously. So your central nervous system is on like super high alert when you're doing those, which is great because the pursuit of strength is neuromuscularly driven. It's the skill that I mentioned before. And so your body has to coordinate all of these actions simultaneously, which makes the deadlift and the squat super effective movements for that purpose. For the exact same reason that those are great movements for strength is sort of why they're not optimal movements for hypertrophy. Because when you do a deadlift, if you ask a handful of people, what does the deadlift work? You're likely to get any of these answers. Quads, hamstrings, glutes, low back, traps, upper back. Anything else? Did I miss any? Maybe those five. But like
your
midline. Yeah, midline.
Yeah.
That's a sexy one. So so yeah, I mean, you're literally liable to get any of those responses. And the truth is that it works all of those areas.
Yeah. And it depends on how you move it too, like your technique.
Yeah, totally.
And sumo versus trap bar versus conventional, right. Like what way are you setting up on that?
Yeah, and I mean, they all extend at three joints. Any of those movements, you're down in a squat, you stand up, it's extending all three of those joints simultaneously. So because of, like I was saying, because of the way that you have to coordinate that action in the body, it's extremely fatiguing. So they will produce hypertrophy. Like if you do deadlifts and squats in the 6 to 12 rep range, like you will get bigger and you will put muscle on.
I was going to say, that's how I got bigger doing that.
Yeah, for sure. There's no reason
8 to 10 reps.
Yeah, there's no reason you can't. Like people have been getting huge on back squats and deadlifts forever. I just think that at this point, we have the ability to select movements that are more specific. And when we talk about this idea of volume, the more you do being the driver of hypertrophy, like how many sets of deadlifts and back squats can you do before your ass is just wrecked?
Not that many. Like I think like when I was training, like I think maybe 3 sets of squats and then maybe 1 set of deadlifts, like a heavy set of deadlifts. That's it. And then you'd be smoked.
So if volume is the main driver of hypertrophy, which I'm not sold on, but there's this idea that it is, right? If the volume is the main driver of hypertrophy, then is 4 sets enough for like your lower body? I don't know. Like the way that I would look at it is when we look at hypertrophy, we can take this back squat that extends at 3 joints and we can make it extend. It still extends at 3 joints. There's nothing we can do about that. If you're going to squat down and stand up, you're going to extend at 3 joints. But we can elevate our heels, which will allow the knees to travel much more forward. And in the knees traveling forward, the compensation that the body does to account for the knees going further forward is that the torso kind of has to stay like a little bit more upright. So we're getting a little bit less involvement from the hips. And when we bend at the hips, as we do in like a typical back squat or deadlift, that is going to engage the low back and the glutes a whole ton. And so if our goal is to use the squat to train the quads, then we can do this kind of heels elevated squat, put the bar super high up on the back, let the knees go forward, keep the torso more vertical. And now we don't need to use nearly as much weight because the quads are just not as strong as the glutes are. And so when we do these heels elevated back squats, we're getting more stimulus to the quads and we're getting less systemic fatigue. Yeah. And so over the course of multiple sets, we can get a lot more out of that. And then the same example would be like an RDL instead of a deadlift. And so an RDL is actually a really cool version of a deadlift, a Romanian deadlift for those that don't know the acronym. But it's a really cool version of the deadlift because it actually only extends at 2 joints. When you do an RDL, you're extending at the hips and then you're breaking at the knees slightly, but there's no break at the ankle. So you're actually really only extending at 1.5 joints. I mean, you can't extend half a joint. So you say you're extending 2 joints, but in reality, the RDL is a much more isolated version to your glutes and your hamstrings than what you're going to get with the conventional sumo or trap bar deadlift. And so those types of modifications to movements can be ubiquitous across the entire selection of exercises. And then you can even expand further from what exercises I choose. And then you can kind of talk about the way that you perform the exercise that you choose. So there's kind of these 2 different avenues that you can approach your movement to get more stimulus to your muscles, but less total fatigue to your body.
Well, that's awesome because I mean, you're taking like a sniper approach, very specific, rather than like shotgunning. Like, hey, let's just do this big compound movement and see what happens, right? I mean, yes, strength has application for things, right? Like if you're a competitive strength athlete, but if you just wanted to build muscle with the least amount of fatigue, like this type of specificity is where you should look for.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great analogy.
And so to kind of like recap all of what Bryan said, it's like basically when we're looking at strength, to get better at things, if we're going to look at the lifts, we typically see a lot of high bar or low bar back squats. We're going to see some sort of deadlift, whether that's conventional sumo, trap bar deadlift. We're going to see a lot of bench press and overhead press or strict press, whichever you want to call it. All of those, well, we have to practice those and we have to lift them heavy and heavier to get better at those because again, it's when we're chasing strength, it doesn't matter what we look like. It doesn't matter anything other than we're just trying to lift more weight. We're trying to get better at the ability to move heavy weight. And then reversely with hypertrophy, we start to see, modifications or we see substitutions on movements because we want to see, okay, what is a quad specific movement that I can target? Okay, what are, a hamstring or glute specific movements that I can do? And so, those modifications might look like, okay, well, in a strength cycle, I do a deadlift. In a hypertrophy cycle where I'm trying to build more muscle, I'm trying to improve my physique, well, we're going to choose something like an RDL or instead of, squatting, as Bryan said, we're going to elevate our heels so that we're targeting specifically the quads and stuff like that. And so it's like, that's so important to understand though, because again, it's like, it's fun to move heavyweight. It's really fun to smash a heavy deadlift, or, it's like, that used to be my shit. Actually, it was like every time I would visit Bryan every like 3 months or so, and I would be like, okay, like last time I hit a triple at 255, so now I'm going to try to hit, insert the blank. Like that was huge for me. And so that's the thing with strength stuff, is it's like, it's really fun to have performance goals. It's really fun to have goals that aren't just also oriented around, well, what do I weigh? How do I look? What is my body, versus when you're also chasing, well, hey, celebrating what my body can do. And like, that progress is so addicting, right? So it's like, it's good to have both of those throughout the year, just because, you're going to get benefits also, just in terms of, it's good to switch up your training on, it's good to, I want to say this carefully, because I also don't want people to go, oh, just do, random training. But it's like, we want to be changing up our training cycles and the things that we're focusing on also, because, it's like, we want all of that to work synergistically, so we can just get the most out of our training and the most out of our time in the gym.
Bryan, I was actually going to ask you on that point. Like, so what would like a training cycle, like, let's just say if over a whole year, like what would that look like in terms of hypertrophy training, strength training? Like, when would you insert a strength training cycle? Or, could you just do hypertrophy the whole time? Like, what was even the point of doing a strength cycle? Like, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we're assuming in this case that the goal is just to improve your physique and look better.
Sure.
For the most part.
Yeah. And functionally strong, like just be able to do shit and not fall
play
apart.
With your kids. And totally.
Yeah.
So the way I kind of look at this now, and my opinion is kind of shifted slightly over the last few years, but I think that ultimately the reason that you would use a strength and then ultimately possibly a metabolic cycle in the periodized year would really be because you're reaching a what's the word I'm looking for? A block in your hypertrophy training. So you're going through many hypertrophy cycles in a row. Say you've done 18 weeks, because we just finished up an 18-week hypertrophy cycle at Paragon. Say you just your progress is slowing. We have this hypertrophy is a stimulus that you can adapt to, and if you adapt to a point, you kind of have to jump out of hypertrophy to resensitize, and that is fringe science. But I think a good analogy that people can understand is sun exposure. So like when you go out into the sun the first time after the winter, you get burnt. Like you go out in the sun for 20 minutes even, and you're just like, whoa, what happened?
Crispy bacon strips.
Yeah, but if you go out in the sun every day for like 7 straight days, your skin becomes much darker, and now you need more sun exposure to be able to continue to get tanner, right? And then eventually you reach a point where your body is just like, hey, this is as tan as I get. Like I can't get any more tan. And so if we think of hypertrophy similarly, it's kind of the same idea. Like you have to continuously increase the stimulus that you're applying to the body via progressive overload. And at some point, that's just gonna stop. Like you can't continue adding weight and reps forever, or else you would be like squatting 1,000 pounds in your 10th year of training.
Well, yeah, your body probably just couldn't handle it at that point, like the fatigue wise, right?
Yeah, totally. So one other facet of hypertrophy is that you have to train a little bit closer to failure. When we're talking about training strength, you really don't have to be close to failure for 2 reasons, really. One, because the movements are so demanding. They extend at 3 joints, like I was saying. They're so fatiguing. But also because you're trying to coordinate all of these complex things at the same time. And if you were to, say, do a deadlift to failure, like you guys have both done this, you do a deadlift that is like the last deadlift you can do, and you can feel it. You know that there's some weird compensation shit happening. You're like, oh, that wasn't exactly what I was trying to do.
Twinge in your back a little bit, that little twinge.
Yeah, or like your back turns into a question mark, and you're like, my glutes and hamstrings aren't working anymore.
Like a goddamn.
Holding like a taco.
So as we try to pursue this increased efficiency in these strength lifts, we don't want to be super close to failure. So kind of going back to the idea of periodizing the year, if you get to that point where hypertrophy is just becoming this kind of daunting task, and This may even occur psychologically before it occurs physiologically. That's what I've noticed with myself is like I can still be progressing my hypertrophy movements, but I just reach a point where I just don't want to do it anymore. And so it's going to be one of those two. Either psychologically, you don't want to do it anymore and you just want a change, or physiologically, your body's like, nope, no more sun exposure. Like you're as dark as you're going to get. So what do you do when you can't get any darker in the sun? Well, you can take some time off of the sun. And then when you go back into it, you're super sensitive to the sun again, right? Same idea can be applied to periodization of training, where if we jump out of hypertrophy for a short period of time and we do some strength work, well, what we've done is we've stopped working in the 6 to 15 rep range. So now we're working in the 1 to 6 rep range. So we have a little bit of resensitization to rep ranges. Strength training is also lower volume. So you're doing less work. So you're resensitizing to volume. And then, what was the other thing? Oh yeah. So we also use something in our Paragon programs on certain types of movements that are like partial reps, essentially, where you take like a movement like here's a perfect example, a bicep curl. Everyone understands bicep curl. So at the bottom of a bicep curl, your bicep is long, it's lengthened, right? It's stretched. And then as you flex your arm up, you can actually feel and see your bicep getting shorter. And so in movements like a bicep curl, what you guys find is that the top of that movement is really, really hard, but the bottom of the movement is not that hard. And so we use things at Paragon to emphasize the range of the motion that isn't hard. So like that bottom portion of the bicep curl, there's a whole ton of good stuff that can happen there. But when you're so limited by what's happening at the top of the rep, it's difficult to actually work the bottom position to proper levels of fatigue. So that's another thing that when we go into strength cycles, we don't do stuff like that. Another thing we don't really do as much in strength cycles is even use isolation movements. So we have this like 4-pronged approach to resensitizing to hypertrophy. And so for psychological or physiological reasons, both really solid reasons to kind of jump out of hypertrophy, do a short strength cycle, get reinvigorated, resensitized, and then kind of jump back into hypertrophy and keep working toward the goal.
Well, and I feel like for most people, it's like, I feel like the number one thing we see especially is it's like people, it's not that people are really like plateauing in their hypertrophy, endeavors and stuff like that. It's like really what's happening is like people just get bored. It's like, hey, after doing 2 or 3 hypertrophy cycles, back to back to back, it's like, it's a lot of counting. It's higher reps. Like you said, it's like the training just is different. It's a little bit more of a burn. It's a different type of pain or a different type of discomfort than, strength training is like, well, if you're only doing 3 reps, you're doing 3 reps, right? That's like, well, if you're doing 12, 13, 14, 15 reps. So it's like, definitely, it's like, I feel like that's the biggest thing is it's like people are about hypertrophy and muscle building training, but it does, it can get stale. It can get a little boring. And so I think we do a really good job at Paragon of inserting regular strength cycles as, again, it's just something to pivot. You get a fresh breath of air, and then you can get back towards the things that maybe are more in line with your personal goals of, hey, I want to look a certain way, or, I'm chasing fat loss, or, whatever it is there.
Yeah. So Bryan, you said that, we just did like an 18-week hypertrophy cycle. How long should hypertrophy cycles run versus strength cycles? Like how do you like to organize the time? And like maybe what would be like the minimum time that you would spend in each?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to how I started that last segment about, the reason you jump out of hypertrophy is because you're just not getting more tan, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that in many ways, the answer of when you jump out into a strength cycle, it's very individually dependent, but I think that 1 to 2 times a year is like a general reasonable number for the general population. And like it could be psychological too, like Lori said, and like I said,
sometimes you want to lift heavy shit, man.
or you're just tired of doing 12 reps on everything.
Yeah.
Like it's maybe you're tired of doing isolation movements and you just want to like do some more complex stuff and work out for 12 seconds in a set instead of 60 seconds. So I mean, I think 1 to 2 a year is fine. I find in my own training that I usually end up doing 1 a year. But I also tend to mix up the hypertrophy that I'm doing, in that I'll do like some lower volume hypertrophy phases, some higher volume hypertrophy phases, some with like some same muscle group supersets or antagonist supersets. Antagonist would be like a chest and a back movement back to back, whereas same muscle group superset might be like doing like a row supersetted with like some bent over rear delt raises or something along those lines. So I'll kind of mix up the way that I do hypertrophy so that it provides some of that novel aspect without having to go completely out and go do strength, but I do find strength to be an important piece for both the psychological and the physiological reasons that I've discussed.
And I think too, like it's just so hard because again, it's like, who are we talking about? Are we talking about somebody maybe like myself or Bryan or you, where it's like, we're good with our body composition at this point. It's like, yeah, we train to kind of maintain what we're doing. But it's like, for me personally, it's like, I feel like I'm kind of past the phase of like doing these big, calorie surpluses to gain a ton of muscle. It's like, ultimately, it's like if I can maintain looking pretty similar to how I'm looking right now the rest of my life, like we're good. Just because again, it's like I'm kind of over that phase. It's like I now have, a boyfriend. I want to go travel and I want to go live life. And so, my body has kind of shifted from, okay, it used to just be about, how can I perform the best, be this best athlete? And then kind of shifted to hyper focusing on aesthetics and getting out of the disaster that I'd created for myself from years of under eating and overtraining and all of that stuff. But B, it's like now here I am. And it's interesting because it's like, okay, well, yeah, we can always look better. But ultimately, again, it's like if I can just maintain exactly where I'm at, I'm doing pretty good. Like I'm cool with that because again, it's like I'm beyond wanting to spend hours and hours in the gym. But mutually, it's like how many people, if they hire a nutrition coach, well, you're hiring a nutrition coach because you're unable to navigate your nutrition stuff by yourself. You need some sort of accountability. For most people, it's like the most common goal we see is, hey, I want to lose body fat. I want to lose weight. I want to get smaller, change these things. And so it's like, well, how often somebody needs to do a strength cycle if they are also trying to chase fat loss and trying to change their body composition and all that. It's like that matters a ton because that was actually one of the questions I wanted to clarify is like, in terms of training cycles, what is the best training cycle to follow if you are dieting, if your goal is, hey, I want to chase fat loss? And then, reversely, we can get into other goals too. But yeah, it's like if we're talking about hypertrophy versus strength, what's going to be the better avenue to get from A to B there?
Yeah, I mean the complexity of the strength movements and the super heavy loads, they're just not going to be great if you're going to be in a caloric deficit. I mean, at least toward the end of the cycle, there's also different ways that you can program strength cycles. So if like the way we do it, going towards a 1 rep max, like, no, you're not going to exceed your PRs and be like super happy with your results if you're in a caloric deficit when we're testing 1 rep maxes. But if your strength phase looks like sets of 3 to 5 with 5 reps from failure, and you're just using it mostly as a way to resensitize to hypertrophy and not necessarily as like, I want to set new PRs and like really impress myself type thing, then I think being in a deficit during that version of strength would be fine. During the version of strength that we have, we do probably want to be sitting at maintenance or a slight surplus, just so that we have enough food to fuel. Like the last thing that you want to do is go up to like a heavy deadlift in week 6 of the cycle, hoping to PR, and then you're famished and your sleep is disrupted because you're not eating enough food and you just don't really feel prepared for that heavy load. So hypertrophy is basically going to be conducive to any goal. And that's why we love hypertrophy so much at Paragon is that if you're in a surplus and you want to gain muscle, boom, hypertrophy is the way to go. If you are at maintenance and you're just trying to, where Lori is and she just wants to maintain body comp, yeah, hypertrophy is where you want to be. And if you're in a deficit, hypertrophy is also where you want to be. There's this big like idea in the internet. Sometimes like people are very confused that there should be like a fat loss program. Like, oh, I'm in fat loss now, so I need to do like high paced circuits and stuff like that. But that's actually very counterintuitive to what you want to do, because those high paced circuits high-paced circuits are going to increase your cortisol, inflammatory responses, and things like that. And when you're in a caloric deficit, those are not the things you want. What you want to do is train in a way that allows you to maintain muscle, because most people beyond the newbie stage aren't going to be building muscle while they're in a caloric deficit. And so hypertrophy training is going to be the best way for you to ensure that you can maintain muscle, even though you're not providing your body with a surplus of nutrition.
And maybe you can speak on that a little more, because I feel like if there is a question we get all the time in the Paragon member group, it's, hey, okay, I'm planning to diet here soon. I'm trying to get all my ducks in a row. I'm following this program, but hey, like, I know I need to add cardio. And it's so fascinating because, again, it's like we have such a different idea and, ideal on how to approach that, because it's like, if you look at, from years and years, it's like I've been coaching 15 plus years, right? So it's like when you start looking at things and, trying to push clients in the direction to make things the easiest, right? Like, how can we make the easiest choice, mutually the best choice? And it's like, well, for so many people, it sucks if you are going and doing HIIT workouts or CrossFit or all of these like high intensity, like spin classes. And you're mutually, it's like, so you have this really, really demanding workout, tons of stress. As a result, how do you feel after you go for a run, right? It's like if I go run 5 miles, I come home and I'm starving. I could, eat the entire household, versus like bodybuilding. I just don't get that stimulus. It's like I get home, it's like I can resume normal business. I can eat the food I need to eat. If I have specific macro and calorie targets, I can hit them without a problem, because it's just a different demand of stimulus and it's a different, stress on the body. And so, it's like, why would you want to be working out in ways that might make it harder to hit your macros? Because again, you're under recovering, you don't have that fuel, you don't have the additional carbs you might if you were at maintenance or a surplus. And so it's like, alternatively, if you have the option of, hey, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm just going to bodybuild and lift, and I'm still going to work out really hard and like have fun, get a good workout. Well, why wouldn't you want the diet to be easy? Like, why wouldn't you don't want to play mental gymnastics, right? Like, that's the worst. Like, I remember, it's like I used to, again, this is all way back in the day, but it's like I would be trying to diet while mutually like doing all of this CrossFit and stuff like that. And it'd be like, I'd be going over on my macros. I'd be like having this self-mental spiral of like, hey, like I'm working towards this goal of aesthetics. I'm trying to lose body fat. I know I need to eat less food, but then mutually I'm starving. So, so what am I doing? I keep going over on my macro goals, and it's like, it doesn't have to be that way, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, if we can get people aboard the train of, hey, being really specific on what is your goal, and we can have it all. We just maybe can't have it all at once. And so if we can get really specific and say, okay, right now, I want to focus on fat loss. Okay, here's what I need to do with my nutrition. How does my training line up with that? And then you ride off into the sunset. And then you can get back to, the fun and doing all those things. Like, that's the sauce, right? Yeah. Helping people optimize that is the sauce. So I think that's just so important to understand. It's like, we can use cardio as a tool, and it's not that cardio is bad. It's just understanding, well, if there's easier ways to get from A to B, well, why wouldn't we want that?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. So I think a parallel here that we can kind of provide is when you were talking earlier about random workouts, random results. The word that kept popping into my head was diagnostics. And that the reason that we have repeating movements in Paragon, and the reason that we have the structure that we do, is because it allows us to diagnose what's happening and then make any necessary changes to ensure that progress is occurring, that we're moving toward our goal. And so the same thing is applied when people talk about cardio and fat loss. Is like, when you do cardio, random cardio, like, HIIT classes or going out for a run randomly, and these aren't things that are just part of a structured schedule that is consistent week to week, it becomes difficult to diagnose even what's happening. And so an example that I often discuss is like, we have this toolbox of different tools that we can use. And so we know if we're dieting, we have to be in a caloric deficit. That is like tool number one. You have to eat less calories. Or you have to take in less energy, would be the way to say that. And so cardio is a tool that can be used to allow you to expend more energy. But it's a very inefficient tool because if we eat 300 calories of extra food, that's 30 minutes of moderate cardio and it's like an hour of walking. So it's much easier to not eat 300 calories than it is to go walk for an hour or go run for 30 minutes to make up for those 300 calories. And so the way that I generally try to approach fat loss with my clients is that we start with nutrition and we start with steps. And steps are for sure cardio. They're just a much lower intensity type of cardio that isn't going to have the recovery consequences that you have with running and or any other like, higher intensity cardio. It could be biking or rowing or whatever it is. And so it's then a tool that you can use. So if we reach a point where we've already dropped calories a couple times and maybe we've increased steps a couple times and we're still getting sticky and we're not making any more progress, then cardio becomes a tool that we can now use. But if we've been using this tool from the beginning, then where do we go? Like if you're already doing 3 or 4 bouts of high intensity cardio a week, what's next? 5, 6 bouts of cardio? like where does it end? And so, yeah, I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then to kind of circle it back to training. The other thing that cardio does is it causes fatigue in your body. So if you run or bike primarily, rowing, sort of, but running or biking is very leg intensive. And so we've seen this across many of my clients over the years where they are doing a cardio session the day before a leg training day. And then they're like, why aren't my leg numbers going up? Or why did they go down? Or whatever the feedback is. And so cardio now has this double negative where it's extra time that you're committing, but it's also causing fatigue that's impacting your training. So there are just better, more efficient ways to go about it.
Dude, side note, I was astonished. It's like, obviously, again, fast forward over time, like I know that, I have a better understanding of all these things, but I was astonished when we trained for the OC half marathon earlier this year because I felt really good in the gym. Like I was running and mutually lifting 3 times a week, following Hypertrophy, and I felt good. And I thought, it's like I felt strong in the gym. And I was astonished when I stopped running. We ran the OC half, stopped running, and then just got back to like straight hypertrophy. And it was like, I remember I was like struggling to hip thrust, like whatever weight. And it was like, fast forward like a month later, just back to like straight up bodybuilding. And it was like all of my lifts and numbers were like, woo. And so it, like I said, it's fascinating to me because it's like most people understand like, hey, if I'm eating less food, if I'm dieting, well, yeah, I might feel a little bit more like dog shit in the gym. But, for so many people, it's like, I get it. Like, again, it's like, I love running, but mutually, I also love lifting. I love doing all these things. And so like finding that balance of like, how do you do the things you love, but then mutually, same thing. It's like, if you have certain goals online, how do you kind of balance all these? And so that was actually something I wanted to ask is, if somebody was in a strength cycle, what are our thoughts about adding cardio there? It's like we obviously understand a person in a strength cycle is probably not dieting based off of, we hope they're following hypertrophy. So should, again, it's like I come back to like the CrossFit world of like, oh, well, I need to keep up my aerobic capacity or my endurance or, my engine. Like, how can I still do cardio during strength? Or should I would love like a brief snippet about that. Cause again, it's something we see all the time. It's like, hey, well, I know we're doing the strength cycle and I'm really excited to max out, but like, also like, I really want to keep, running twice a week or, whatever it is.
Yeah. It's interesting what you said about the OC half and your strength numbers because you were not in a deficit. I know that you were eating to support your training. So you were noticing a decrement in performance. And granted, you were doing like a ton of cardio. It wasn't just going out for like a 2 or 3 mile run casually. But you were noticing a decrement in performance from eating in a surplus while running. And so I think that a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the research on concurrent training, which is concurrent means essentially lifting and doing some sort of cardio endeavor along with it. The research was leaning towards the idea of cardio being this really awful thing. And the research recently has kind of begun to swing the other way, which now kind of shows that if you're in a surplus and you're doing this in a very mutually compatible manner, which I'll discuss in a second, that you should be able to continue lifting and make progress in the gym, and you should be able to do your running. Now, I think doing it in a compatible manner is the important part, because the research on concurrent training that shows that it's productive, it has you select one of the two as your primary. And I think that that's the key. If you're trying to make running your primary, like you were during the OC half, that was your main focus each time you went out there, was trying to get ready for that half marathon. So it was taking over both your mental bandwidth and your physical output. And so if you're doing a strength cycle with us, the key is going to be that your cardio is not the primary. That is something that you're doing on the side, but it shouldn't consume your mental bandwidth. It shouldn't consume most of your physical bandwidth either, in that it should be lower effort. So that's one of the other things, is one of them has to be lower effort and one has to be higher effort. So you have to make your cardio lower effort. And then you just want to make sure that you keep those cardio sessions as far away from your lower body sessions as possible. And so we always talk about in Paragon that if you're going to do cardio with our programming, whether it's hypertrophy or strength, that you just want to try and do it on the upper body day, because our programming goes lower, upper, lower, upper. And so if you train lower, then you train upper, and then you do your cardio, you have a rest day after the upper body day, and then you come back and do lower again. So if you were to run on that rest day, you would be doing it directly prior to your leg day. Whereas if you do it on the upper body day, like say you train upper body at one point and then you run later in the day, we also encourage you not to run before your weight training session. If they're done in the same session, you would want to upper body then run. Then I think you should be fine, as long as you're keeping that proximity a little bit further.
So, Bryan, I have a question about this. So this is kind of under an assumption that, okay, if you're doing a strength cycle, that you want to hit a PR at the end of the cycle. This is that assumption. But what if strength is actually not your main focus, but you have other focus? For example, like I'll use myself, right? Like I do jujitsu, and I also lift, and we're going to head into that strength cycle. And I was definitely planning on doing the strength cycles. It's been a long time since I've lifted something heavy, but let's just say my goal is actually not to maximize strength here. What then would be the case? How would I approach training in this case?
Yeah, I actually wouldn't one rep max then. I just wouldn't even put yourself through that, because there's so much mental fortitude.
Which I don't actually.
Yeah.
Over here sandbagging it.
Like, no, I'm serious. Like what I tend to do is I usually have about like what I can feel, maybe like 3 reps or like 3 reps, 2 or 3 reps in the tank. Like I never really go for like a true 1 rep max.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that, as long as you're not, so when we look at week 1 of our strength cycle, after, we'll call it week 2, because week 1 is our like deload intro week. But in week 2 of our strength cycle, we have a single rep that is with 4 reps from failure. So essentially you're taking a weight that you could do 5 times and you're just doing it 1 time. And then we have some back off sets. And then these sets in week 2 are going to be sets of 5. And they're going to be with a weight that you could do 8 or 9 times. So it's kind of like what you were saying, leaving around 3 reps in the tank or something like that. And obviously those progress week to week. So, we had 4-ish reps from failure in that week. And by the time we get to the final single rep testing week, everything is basically to capacity within the constraints of safety. I just wouldn't do that. Like I wouldn't do that. And I would also say that, what I mentioned earlier was that you can get all of the benefits that you want physiologically of the strength cycle by doing sets of 3 to 5. Like you don't really have to do sets of 1 to 2. We do that because we love to see our members get strong. Our members love to set PRs, and like they've kind of earned that right. But like you can get all of the physiological benefits of a strength cycle doing triples at an 8 RM. And so there was a really cool study that I referenced in our blog where they compared equal volumes, which makes the study great, where you either did 4 sets of 10 to failure. So this is our hypertrophy rep range, right? 4 sets of 10 to failure. Or you take the exact same weight, which is your 10 rep max, and you do 8 sets of 5. And so every single one of those 8 sets of 5 is basically 5 reps from failure because you're using a 10 rep max weight. And the people that did the 8 sets of 5 with 5 reps from failure on every set increased strength more than the group that did 4 sets of 10 to failure. But the group that did 4 sets of 10 to failure increased hypertrophy more. And so what we see there is a perfect example of what I was talking about, where A, you don't need to be super close to failure when you do strength work. And B, you need to do lower reps. That study shows both of those things as fact. So in your case, what I would recommend is probably either like you're smart enough at this point to know that if you want to do singles, but you don't have to. You could do sets of 3 and with an 8 RM, and you would be totally in line with all of the objectives of the cycle. And it would allow you to approach strength training as not your number one priority, since you have jujitsu is that your number one priority at this point?
For sure.
Yeah. So jujitsu is number one priority, which means when we're doing concurrent training, we need to choose one that's not our priority, and we need to work less hard on the thing that's not the priority.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's huge, because it's like, again, the bigger thing that Alex said was like, hey, like my number one priority is this sport. I want to get really, really good at jujitsu. And so just helping people to kind of get in bed with, again, it's like, you can do all the things, you just can't do them all at once, in terms of, well, if you're going to be the fastest runner, or you're going to absolutely smash, these ultra marathons or Spartan races or whatever you're doing, awesome. Just understand, we can't go max out, and we can't live big on all, aspects. So it's like mutually we're going to have to pull back somewhere else. It's like there's going to have to be give and take. And so what's important to you, and what do you really want to, maximize there? And then what are you okay with being more of a supportive role? And, I think it definitely goes like this too. It's like I've known Alex during periods where it was like, I just want to, lift heavy and be the strongest person. And then reverse, now he's kind of doing this again, where it's like, okay, now I really, really want to get good at jujitsu. So now my training in the gym is just supporting that endeavor, rather than, you can try, to be the fastest runner and the fastest, lifter, or same thing, or, the biggest lifter or whatever. But I think just helping people to understand kind of that give and take of, well, what's important to me in this phase? Because like for me personally, it's like I ran the OC, half marathon. And I was like, okay, I'm feeling shrimpy. I'm feeling tiny. Like I'm definitely ready to get back to lifting heavy or train different. So just helping people kind of understand that is super huge. Yeah. I think the last question we had, unless you want to jump in, Alex, was just what type of training cycle would be best for total beginners?
Yeah, I mean, I think hypertrophy has to be the answer there. Like there's no reason that someone brand new to the lifting game needs to be relegated to just those 3 big movements. I mean, I think there's certainly benefit to learning how to coordinate the complexity of extending at 3 joints at the same time, like we've kind of referenced throughout this whole episode. But the forgiving aspect of hypertrophy, in that you can train in higher rep ranges, you can train with lighter loads, you can facilitate creating a mind-muscle connection. You can learn to actually use the muscle that you're intending to use. I think all of those things kind of make hypertrophy just the most forgiving adaptation, and one that is the most universally accessible.
Yeah, like when you're a beginner, I mean, a lot of it is just learning the movement, So if you have an opportunity to do, the movement a bunch of times, and then obviously you're doing, lower loads, and you're really focusing on movement quality, then you're going to have like a really solid foundation to build strength upon. Because I mean, I remember when I went back in weightlifting days, like if I remember doing squats and things like that and deadlifts, and unfortunately I did not have the best movement patterns and quality, and you try to stack load on top of shitty movement, like that is a recipe for injury, because speaking from experience.
I love what you said about the repetition piece, because like you said, especially as a beginner, if you can do sets of 12 to 15 where you're getting to practice that movement 15 times on every set, that's way better than trying to practice the movement 3 times or 4 times or whatever the rep scheme is. So you're getting tons more practice, and then that's just going to amplify the effects over time.
Yeah. And not to mention, if you're a total beginner, like practically anything you do will work. So like path of least resistance. Like, do you sit there and try to do something that's like pretty technical, like, you know, a deadlift, which seems simple, but it's very technical? Or do you do something like maybe that's a little bit less, you know, technique focused and then still get the same or better result?
I've had a lot of success with teaching people RDLs before teaching them deadlifts.
100%. Like trying to pull a deadlift from the floor, like somebody who's never done it before. Good God.
Well, Bryan, I think our time is up for today. Where can people find you?
I mean, Paragon Training Methods, of course. But yeah, I'm on Instagram at Bryan Boorstein. So check out all the Paragon Training Methods things and then check me out.
And Bryan also has his own podcast as well. So especially if you love nerding out kind of on the fitness and training side of things, his co-host, Aaron Straker, is actually super involved with nutrition. So kind of just like, you know, I'm super nerdy about nutrition, Bryan's super nerdy about fitness. It's the same, but diffy, basically on Bryan's podcast. So if you want to tell them a little deets on where they can find that.
Yeah, totally. It's Eat, Train, Prosper. And we have an Instagram as well as a YouTube. But like Lori said, we do kind of get into the nitty gritty of training. And we've been really obsessed with this topic of muscle length, which I very slightly alluded to on this podcast where I was talking about the bicep curl and how it's long at one position and short at another. This is a huge piece of where science is going these days. And so we've spent a number of episodes recently breaking all that stuff down. So if you're somebody that likes kind of more of the nuance of training, then I would check that out for us.
Awesome, y'all. Well, Alex Macklin, got anything you want to say before we bounce for this week?
Not much, man. I just really liked having Bryan on and having him school us and just, I mean, really, I think the best thing about this is just like you broke it down in a way where it's like pretty, like very understandable for like just a lot of people to understand. Like, hey, like what's the difference between hypertrophy? What's the difference between strength? When can we use these, like the applications of such and like what to consider? I think that's super important. And then, I mean, you know, especially if you have these goals, right? Like it's important to be doing the training program and training style that it's going to support the goals, but also too, like just so that you can be able to do it in a long-term way, like not beat your body up to death, right?
Yeah. Well, it was an honor being on, and I appreciate that you guys came with a bunch of really good questions.
Totally, y'all. Well, with that being said, if you want to come get strong with us, we will have brand new training cycles at Paragon. We'll beginning January 16th. So we'll have opportunity for a 6-week strength cycle, and then we'll have opportunity for a 6-week hypertrophy cycle. But that is all we have for this week. Later, y'all.